My name is Matthew Phelps, and I am the Minister of Music at West End United Methodist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm very proud to be bringing you this sectional for the Hymn Society's 2021 conference, Singing Welcome. About 5 years ago, a man walked up to me at West End and introduced himself as Sam, and had a wonderful conversation about our service and our worship. And after he walked away, somebody came up to me and said, "Do you know who you were just talking to?" And I said, "No, I really don't." And that person told me, "Well, that was Carlton Young. He edited our hymnal." Ever since that day, Sam and I have had numerous wonderful conversations about music and about worship. And this has turned into a friendship that I treasure. And it is my hope that this sectional gives you the opportunity to peek in on some of the conversations we've had over the years, and also some in-depth conversation on where we're headed as a church, as hymn writers and as music ministers. How can we best position ourselves to come out of the pandemic stronger than we were before? Can you talk just a little bit about some of your most interesting experiences growing up as a child and becoming a musician?
Well, I was brought up in southwestern Ohio, Hamilton, Ohio, which was an industrial town that was greatly affected by the Depression. And our family, I was raised by my grandparents, moved to a farm as a caretaker of a farm. And I was fortunate enough to be admitted into what they called in those days a centralized school, which meant that the small schools were put together into one large unit, and within that, music and the arts was a requirement, which I traced that back, Matt, pretty much into the Teachers College at University of Cincinnati, and then into Columbia. I get that kind of trackage that the arts were felt to be not just frills at the edge, but they were integral to an education. And I was fortunate to have a teacher whose name was Albert Sutphen. He came to Hamilton, Fairfield now. I think he was second principal in the Cleveland Orchestra, and he became interested in music ed and moved to the Southwest. And he was the kind of person that says, if you want to do it, try it. And consequently, I learned from him all the brass instruments, the fingering and such, everything from baritone to trombone to trumpet. And he had a way to teach. He had to teach, of course, in terms of a requirement. These were not electives. And when he would teach the themes from a symphony, for example, the Tchaikovsky Fourth, he taught the theme like this: "Pass me the soup, Mrs. Murphy. Pass me the soup, Mrs. Murphy." So forth. And of course, here it is, 75 or more years later, and I'm still recalling that. And that's how insightful some teachers are to the obvious way. And his influence was great to me. And at one point he said, "Had you ever thought of picking up the string bass?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, we got one." And it was a plywood K of that, of that generation. And I got the fingering of it and was playing in my senior year fairly amateur bowing and simple things. But he was very influential. And I just say to all teachers and those who enable teaching to happen, it's very important that early on talent be recognized and encouraged. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's too late. Other things get in the way. But
Hmm.
that teacher, for example, uh, I wasn't the only one that graduated from that little school and went into music. Others did too.
You know, you had mentioned how you learned that melody, and it actually reminds me, my wife and I were talking this morning even about how we make such a big deal, especially as singers, about reading music, and learning to read music, which of course is an important skill. But a lot of times people will come up to me and say, I want to join the choir, but I don't read music that well. And I always tell them it's actually not, to me, it's more important how well you remember a melody than how well you read it the first time. If you can internalize them, if you can internalize your line, I actually really don't care how fast you learn it. It's more about how well you internalize it. And that's just such a great story about how even to this day, you have that melody internalized from what was really, almost a kind of rote pedagogical method, which is, yeah, that's just really interesting as a choir director.
The other influence in my life, I was not even aware of it until I was a teenager, was I had an uncle who, very famous bassist, a jazz bassist. He played with Vic Beiderbecke, outstanding trumpeter of that time, the 20s. And they formed the Wolverines, which was a group that essentially did, it was an alternative to Dixieland. It wasn't quite swing, but they did a lot of campus dates. And their fame took them to New York, and both of them, I think there were three or four of them from the Wolverines, became a part of the Paul Whiteman Orchestra of considerable fame.
Mhm.
And that later on, when I began to think, uh, you know, where's this musical interest come from? I think part of it was put there. I guess I could just say not intentionally by my grandparents. I remember distinctly not wanting to play the piano, but they insisted that I go to piano classes. And they cost 25 cents. And I remember that teacher, this is anecdotal, just she would play like a flatted ninth. And she says, these chords are just terrible. And I was sitting there thinking, boy, they really sound great. And she was so antithetical. She didn't want to, even say that it existed, yet she wanted to complain about it. And that got my interest in harmonic sounds somehow, her complaint.
One thing Sam and I have in common is that we're both from Cincinnati, and we both went to the College Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati, and that gave us an opportunity to bond being from a similar place and going to the same school. He loves to talk about jazz and his music, and I found it very interesting that when he went to CCM, jazz was still not the most well respected art form.
I went to the Cincinnati College of Music and found absolutely no interest in jazz in those days. Although Doris Day was a student in the radio department and they had jazz background, but that was another, uh, it was a very strict uh, 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 separation between jazz and what the teachers would call real music. Well, this is, and you attended the conservatory.
I did.
I'm not many years later, but I'm sure that has disappeared completely.
Completely. Well, and that was one small thing I didn't put in my introduction is we also shared that we're both from Cincinnati and both went to the conservatory. And yes, by the time I got there, not only had the conservatory fully accepted jazz, there's a very large jazz department there, but also, of course, when I was growing up in Cincinnati, they had the Blue Wisp Jazz Club, which unfortunately I think is closed down now. But even in high school, my friends and I on Tuesday nights would go down to the jazz club and sneak in, even though we were underage, and get to listen to jazz every week. We loved it. Cincinnati actually became a great place for jazz while I was growing up.
Uh, well, there was a cotton club and some other places around Cincinnati that had,
Mhm.
those of us, including you, I'm sure, in your family, couldn't afford to even go to the dinner, let
It
alone.
was the dinner club in Covington, right? Was
Yeah.
that there? Yeah.
And some, and I think that the smaller clubs in Cincinnati have been. I'm writing my autobiography. I'm doing some tracing, and there were a number of clubs segregated,
Hmm.
white and black, for the most part, in Cincinnati. Across the river, there was a more of an openness, and that's I haven't traced that one. I don't know the history of Newport and
Oh, Newport's got a rich history in that regard. Yeah,
of Covington. I think it was a bit. What'd you say?
there are some things we could talk about, some things in Newport, but I'm not sure we should do it for a sacred conference. In interviews Sam has given over the years, he loves talking about how jazz has influenced his writing and his composition. So, learning about how he grew up around jazz and how he performed jazz, I've always loved listening to him talk about how jazz has made its way into sacred music for him as both a composer and as an editor. Because jazz was such an influence for you, you've tried to incorporate that in both your composition and editing. I mean, were you getting pushback in those early days when it wasn't so well accepted to use that kind of harmony and that kind of structure? I mean, how did you navigate that as you were coming of?
Well, I think, Matt, that the musicological community was slow to move in and embrace the obvious. And with that, at least in Boston and Harvard and Boston University, there was still this split. And while it was not jazz was not called inferior music, it was considered something that they didn't want to deal with. Many of them, and I found that uh, that Ellington's, for example, one of the compositions from uh, Beige and Blue, uh, I got that's the wrong title, is Come Sunday,
Mhm.
which is a sort of a ballad, Broadway ballad, but that's the form of it. The sound of it is jazz, and uh, those kinds of influences were slow to get into what I would call the church. There's a very famous Lutheran church. I think it's St. Peter's Church in Manhattan. That maybe it still has a jazz vespers, but I would visit it occasionally on when I go to New
Mhm.
York. And
They did when I lived in New York. I don't know if it's still going on or not, but when I was in Manhattan, they still had jazz vespers.
they did.
Hmm.
Uh-huh. Well, that was an integration of liturgy and congregational song with jazz. Now, one of the problems of jazz is that, in terms of integrating it into worship patterns, is that jazz is an art form that demands movement. That is, it could be subtle movement, it could be dance, it could be just whatever the rhythm, and the notion that congregations of any size can do the subtleties of jazz. That's a problem, I think, of performance
Mhm.
practice.
Yeah.
And that's been, well, I don't object to jazz so much as I'm impressed with those who are able uh, to write uh, and integrate the sounds of jazz, knowing the limitations,
Hmm.
that it's a participatory art between the artist and the listener
Hmm.
in ways that the symphonic literature may not have that, but of course, symphonic literature has picked up jazz motives uh, in the last, 50, 60 years.
Being such a great composer, Sam always starts with the text. It's what makes him a great editor, too. Some of our best conversations has been around text and music and how it fits together, and I'm extremely fascinated by Sam's work as an editor in the late 80s, and how text and diversity and inclusion became such an important part of his work. He was really ahead of his time in a lot of ways. So it's always fascinating to speak with him about text and what makes a great text and how to make that text fit the music.
One of the things that I've often talked about is at a fairly, again, traditional cathedral-like church, our bread and butter can be some of those hymns from the late 19th, early 20th century, but we are always on the lookout for hymn texts that could maybe fit those tunes that I know our congregation would know, but have some of the more inclusive theology that we have taken on as a congregation. And sometimes that we're always on the lookout for stuff like that as a music ministry.
Well, I think if I could just that's a very good point. And let me just back up one bit. Text writers tend to think that the hymn that they are writing is the last one that they'll ever do. And they're very wordy, and they say too much. Jazz is best, in my mind, when it says too little and lets the listener participate by listening and by moving. The more complex jazz is strictly listening.
Yeah.
And that, of course, that's another story.
That's
but
another topic.
I do think I sense that there is a conflict between the purpose of hymn writing, because words and music in hymnody are usually separate in their creation, and they're brought together by editors and compilers. For example, Jane Marshall would be an example of someone who writes both words and music. There are several, and I find that the simplicity of their texts are more appropriate than those editors like me, that try to bring in very complex theological kinds of things and match it to music. And that's again, that's an editorial challenge that I've had in my career, particularly working with committees and trying to find what they would like to have as a match of musical sounds and styles and words. I've had some success in that, and I think that the 89 hymnal probably, because of its diversity of styles, probably reaches into that area a bit more than previous Methodist hymnals, certainly, than the 66 hymnals, way beyond that one.
Of course, diversity and equity and inclusion is a huge topic of conversation among many organizations right now, not the least of which are churches. And you were kind of a pioneer in that in the 1989 hymnal with your inclusion of different styles. How difficult of a process was that for you?
We were fortunate as a committee, which was formed in 1984 by the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. We were fortunate that the Board of Discipleship had 4 ethnic groups that were active in various ways of expressing their heritages and also their political relationship to a church. In that, all of them had produced hymnal supplements in their traditions of both language and style. So we didn't have to go through that as a committee and say, wouldn't it be nice if? They were already there. And it was a matter of bringing in Hispanic and African American, Native American, and Asian American kinds of input. And I think that that's the strength of that hymnal is diversity. I don't know where you stand, and I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah,
you would affirm that. But in terms
absolutely.
of
It's the diversity wise. I mean, I think it's the strongest hymnal that I've used in my career, and I've worked for the Methodists, but I've also worked for Reformed Church and Presbyterians, and I've worked for Catholics. And no, the Methodist hymnal is the most diverse out of all of them, with maybe the Presbyterian hymnal coming in a close second with some of their settings they included. But there's one, actually, I'm pulling my hymnal out. There's one, and you and I have talked about this hymn before. This is not necessarily a diverse hymn in the sense that it was written by, by someone who wasn't of European descent. But there's the one hymn by Al Carmines in the hymnal that probably appears in no other hymnal that I know of, and it's Many Gifts, One Spirit. And I only lift that up because this is a hymn that, even though it wasn't necessarily written by a person of color, it speaks to just how important inclusivity is. There's it's the second verse. I'm just going to read this text. This was by Al Carmines. The text is by him too. God of many colors, God of many signs, you have made us different, blessing many kinds. As the old ways disappear, let your love cast out our fear. And if you think about it, I mean, that is a line that speaks to a hymnal being produced today, and yet you had that hymn in a hymnal in 1989. I mean, I think that's extremely impressive.
I think it was picked up on a mat by only one hymnal. I believe the UCC 1995.
Okay.
I believe that. That had a struggle. That hymn had a struggle because I won't name the names, but there were people on our committee who just said, "Well, that's just boom chunk stuff." They were speaking of the and that's the one thing that editors have to be very careful. They have to affirm that as an opinion, knowing full well that it's junk. That's a stylistic consideration, but there are various styles, and it fits perfectly with those words because it lets the words out and doesn't music doesn't get in the way of the word.
And admittedly, when I've done that hymn at West End, especially around General Conference a couple years ago, we did that hymn at West End. And I mean, admittedly, I reharmonized it, but I reharmonize every hymn, whether it's from the 19th century or we all reharmonize. I mean, I think I don't see why that should have gotten in the way. I mean, all of us take a little bit of liberty with these things. Anyway.
Well, I think that editing of hymnals it brings me back to the definition of one of the mentors I had at the United Methodist Publishing House, called Methodist Publishing House, many years ago. He said, "A book is never published until it's read." And I think that that's true of composers, that a composition is not fulfilled until it is sung or played or listened to. And when you think of that as a composer or as a practitioner, and that gets you beyond your keyboard and beyond your own understandings of tempo, of style, moving maybe alternative harmonizations into some stanzas, because it's the listener that's important. Your importance is to convey and to have an imagination.
As you can imagine, over the past year, most of our conversations have revolved around the pandemic and how congregations will worship in the next year, 2 years, and even 5 years. Sam wrote something very beautiful to me that I read back to him to get his reaction to. And as you can see, he has some very deep thoughts and some very optimistic views about the future of worship, both in person and digitally. You wrote this, you actually wrote this to me, and you sent it to a couple other people, but I was really moved by it.
So I want to read this and I want to get your reaction to it since it's been 6 months since you wrote this to me. You wrote, worship music is always real, not virtual. All kinds of worship music received while gathered or dispersed.
It's 3:45.
Or recorded goes unabated to our emotional centers and prompts the recall of previous contexts in which that music was performed, as well as establishing new oral, physical, personal contexts. Performing the latter's music can and often does prompt total recall from our memory bank. You all, speaking to us music ministers, you all professionally and pastorally practice the most essential task of the church music educator, which is to form and align religious, social, and personal experiences with music worth remembering.
Oh my. Did I say that?
You did. You did say that.
Yeah, I wrote that. I don't know what reaction. I think it was maybe my first experience with the so-called virtual worship over a period of several months. I began to think about what is real, and everything that comes through this virtual is not virtual. Music is the only virtual because it has no limits in terms of the sound coming from your computer or wherever, your iPhone, and the words and the visuals sort of stay trapped, but the music comes out, and it's I think I'm not sure I said in that that music is always virtual and it's always real at the same time. And with that gift that God has given us all, the recall of previous experiences, social, religious, family, those are called up by music many times very strongly, and in ways that many preachers do not understand, that the spoken word has limitations, but the integration of music and preaching has endless possibilities. I'm not putting any criticism on preaching. I'm just indicating that that a factor, I think it was Archibald Davidson at Harvard, called it the recall factor, and he felt, I think E.S. Shermer published in the Concord series, that was the manifestation in publishing of putting, I'll say, good sounds into the ears of children and other people, because the recall then would have more possibility of the elaboration than obvious kinds of just hello, how are you? And he was a kind of out front with that one. I think the E.C. Shermer catalog, I think they did a lot of translations of fairly good literature. That's all passed down there now.
You had mentioned, you and I have talked about how you actually think the future of a lot of our hymnody and a lot of our congregational song is what you would call kind of unison art song.
Yes.
As opposed to a four-part homophonic texture, which we're used to from a lot of our older hymns. You see a lot of future in more monophonic or more just singular unison line melodies.
I can respond this way because since that I said that, I have experienced a graveside service which was streamed, and a solo voice sang "A Mighty Fortress." And I had never thought of one voice singing at least two or three, I think it's all four stanzas. It was a cultured voice, trained voice. And I think that there's something that's going to come back into prominence by way of this virtual worship uh, patterns and kinds of invitations to listen rather than to fully participate. So I find that the solo and soli sounds are going to come out very strong because that's what's being exploited right now. I think that am I reading that one right?
I think so. I think I see, especially among newer hymnody being written, the sense of melody is, I think it's just more prominent because we're now influenced by more contemporary type hymns, some of the folk hymn tradition. The melodies reflect that, and those are often harder to make fit into a more homophonic structure.
Well, I always start with melody in my writing. There's several of us, Jane Marshall, I think that Alice Parker, the same as write the text, type it, get the accents and the sounds from English that come up from the page, begin to form a melody and rhythmic underpinnings of that. The harmony comes later, and it may not be as necessary today as it was 100 years ago. I think that the gospel hymn was always four-part. I may be corrected by some viewer on this, but I think that the four-part harmony of essentially three chords and sometimes a secondary seven introduced, but for the most part, a bass could sing, two or three notes and sing the whole thing. And that has been a big influence in particularly in North American hymnody.
My favorite hymn of all time. Well, my favorite hymn sometimes. But one of my favorite hymns is that setting of "There Is a Wideness in God's Mercy" by Calvin Hampton in the 1952 hymn. And that's just a straight melody. That's not. I don't think that's harmonized. I don't think so. But that's just. I mean, that when you've talked about kind of that art song type style hymn, that's the one that immediately comes to mind. I think that's just one of the most stunning hymns ever written.
To wrap up our conversation, I just wanted to give Sam a chance to give us some inspirational words as hymn writers and as music ministers, because over the next year, we might need some inspirational words as we try to find new ways to do what we do and to welcome our congregations back. And he didn't disappoint. He gave some wonderful thoughts that I hope will help you through the coming year as we all navigate this together as music ministers.
What do you think we should all be thinking about over the next couple years as we try and climb out of?
Well, I don't know. I don't know in the fullness of my answer would be any more helpful than just almost anecdotal, and that is learn from what you have done the last year. And I think the learning of that and the recall of it will put us into new patterns which involve streaming and which involve, I think, the unison and the soli choral sound is going to be one of the byproducts that comes out from here, that the large, massive sounds are of necessity have had to give way to very intimate and kind of focused vocal sounds from choirs and from. But on the other hand, the welcoming back of full congregations ought to give a challenge to those directors such as you to engage the congregation in a new relationship, not to try to recall what used to be, but what can happen in terms of mobility and presence and the abilities of directors to teach in ways that they haven't had to do that because they've been doing programming and getting on with it.
Yeah.
I think there's a relaxation that's going to take place, I hope. And
I'll leave you with this thought. I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about this idea of returning to normal. And I can't stand hearing people say return to normal. But at the same time, I don't like the idea that we're returning to something different because honestly, I mean, our normal at West End, we all really loved. We don't want to lose what we love. So what we decided was
It's 4 o'clock.
we are returning to the moments where the hair stands up on the back of your neck. That's what we're returning to. Because we can create those moments in many different contexts. We can create those moments with the context we may have had before the pandemic, but if we have to have new contexts, new people, new environments, we can create those moments there too. So we're making the focus on returning to the experience and not necessarily returning to something specific from before the pandemic.
well, it'd be interesting to see those who have experienced worship from only a virtual new people from Europe and Asia who, tune in to West End Church. What will they do when the virtual has either been modified or disappears? Interesting.
What we're talking about. I mean, we were live streaming before the pandemic. We already live streamed, but we honed our live streaming skills to make it a little bit more of a, I don't want to say I guess it is. It's a little bit more of a production. Before the pandemic, we turned the cameras on and we had multiple cameras and they moved around and zoomed in and zoomed out, but it wasn't as scripted or thought out as it is now. And those kind of elements are staying. I mean, even as congregations come in, those kind of elements to the live stream are all staying, to the point where, like, this was a big discussion in our staff meeting last week. We're asking the congregation to sit through the postlude, because if they stand up, they're going to start talking, and if they start talking, the people on the live stream will not be able to sit and enjoy the postlude. So there are going to be little things like that. They're going to remain. They're going to stay. But we all have also talked about how will the experience change for the person watching on live stream when there are people in the congregation? Are they going to feel like more of an outsider? Are they going to feel like more of an interloper? The thing about the live stream now is that, when we were just doing live stream, was that it was for you at home. Like it was only live stream. It was basically a TV show for you at home. Now, as we add the congregation in, it's going to be impossible to not speak to the congregation, not to worship with the congregation. So how do we keep the experience for the person on the live stream still intimate enough that you feel connected to it?
Well, this has been a real pleasure.
Sam, this is absolutely, I always enjoy talking to you, and it was great that we got to talk to each other and let people kind of sit in and hear us chat about things. And we just wish you all the best. And I look forward to the next chance we have to talk again. And to those of you who are attending the conference, thank you for attending our sectional. And we hope to see you at more things in the conference over the next couple of days. So Sam, thank you again.
Bye.